In 1924, International Harvester introduced a tractor that solved a problem every other manufacturer had failed to crack for 2 decades. That problem was row crop cultivation, and understanding why it was so difficult to solve tells you something important about how agricultural machinery actually develops. Row crops, corn, cotton, soybeans, sorghum, are planted in parallel rows with precise spacing. The crop grows between those rows, and it needs to be cultivated, the soil around each plant broken up to suppress weeds and improve aeration. Before the Farmall, all of that cultivation was done by hand or by horse-drawn equipment, a man walking behind a mule, guiding a single-row cultivator between plants 1 row at a time. It was slow, physically exhausting work. A good team and an experienced operator might cultivate 4 to 5 acres per day on corn ground. The question that engineers at International Harvester, at Ford, at Case, and at dozens of smaller manufacturers had been trying to answer since the early 1900s was simple to state and difficult to solve. Could a tractor do this job? The answer, it turned out, was not simply a matter of power, it was a matter of geometry. To understand why, we need to look at what a standard tractor of the early 1920s actually looked like and what its geometry made impossible. The dominant tractor of the early 1920s was the Fordson Model F, introduced in 1917. By 1923, Ford was producing over 100,000 Fordsons per year, more than all other tractor manufacturers combined. The Fordson was a capable general-purpose tractor. It could pull a plow, run a belt drive, and haul loads. What it could not do was cultivate between crop rows. The reason was its front axle. Like virtually every tractor of the era, the Fordson had a wide, straight front axle, typically as wide as or wider than its rear wheels. A wide front axle means the front wheels track at the same width as the rear wheels, or wider. When you drive that tractor down a row of corn, the front wheels must travel between crop rows. If the row spacing was 40 inches, which was standard for corn, and the tractor's front axle width was also 40 inches, the front wheels would roll directly over the plants. You could adjust the rear wheel spacing on some tractors to straddle the rows, but the front wheels had nowhere to go. A wide front axle on a standard tractor simply could not thread between crop rows without destroying the crop. Farmers understood this. Equipment dealers understood it. International Harvester's own engineers had been working on the row crop problem since at least 1915, nearly a decade before the Farmall Regular appeared. The engineering team at International Harvester's experimental department in Chicago tried multiple approaches through the late teens and early 1920s. Articulated front axles, offset wheel positions, angled steering geometry. None produced a satisfactory result. The solution that finally worked came from rethinking the front-end geometry entirely, not adjusting it, but replacing it. Instead of a wide front axle, the Farmall Regular used 2 front wheels mounted close together, sometimes called a tricycle front end or a narrow front, with both wheels tracking in the same furrow between 2 crop rows. With both front wheels tracking in a single furrow between rows, the tractor could straddle 1 row while the front wheels traveled in the adjacent space, leaving the crop plants untouched on either side. The rear axle was designed with adjustable wheel spacing. The wheels could be moved inward or outward on the axle to match different row widths. For standard 40-inch corn rows, the rear wheels were set to straddle 2 rows simultaneously. This combination, narrow tricycle front plus adjustable rear, meant the Farmall could navigate between crop rows that no previous tractor had been able to enter. But the front-end geometry alone was not enough. A tractor that could drive between rows still needed to carry cultivation tools, and mounting those tools on a conventional tractor frame put them in the wrong place. On a horse-drawn cultivator, the tools, the shovels and sweeps that break soil between plants, were mounted directly under the operator, who could watch the soil and steer the tools around individual plants with hand levers. The operator had direct visual contact with the soil and the plants at all times. The tools were right in front of them, responsive to small hand movements. On early attempts to mount cultivators on tractors, the tools were attached to the front of the tractor, ahead of the front wheels. The operator, seated well behind the engine, had almost no visibility of what the tools were doing. The result was imprecise cultivation. Plants damaged, weeds left in the soil near stems, where the tools could not safely reach without supervision, the operator could not provide. International Harvester's solution was to mount the cultivator tools in the belly of the tractor, between the front and rear axles, directly below the operator's seat. With the cultivator tools directly below the seat, the operator could look straight down and see exactly where each shovel and sweep was working relative to the crop plants. This restored the visual feedback loop that horse-drawn cultivation had always provided, and it made tractor cultivation precise enough to work close to individual plants. The third engineering element was ground clearance. Row crops, particularly corn in mid-season, grow tall, and the tractor needs to pass over the plants in the rows it straddles without the frame or axle contacting the foliage. The Farmall Regular was designed with a high-arched rear axle and elevated frame, providing approximately 30 inches of clearance beneath the axle housing, enough to pass over young to mid-season corn without contact. Three engineering decisions working together: tricycle narrow front, belly-mounted cultivator, and high rear axle clearance. Each one was necessary. None was sufficient alone. The Farmall Regular's engine was a four-cylinder unit, producing approximately 13 belt horsepower and 9.5 drawbar horsepower, modest by later standards, but well-matched to the cultivation work it was designed to perform. At cultivation speeds, typically 3 to 4 miles per hour, 13 horsepower was more than adequate. The limiting factor in cultivation is not power but precision, and the Farmall provided both. The Farmall Regular also incorporated a power takeoff, a rotating shaft at the rear of the tractor that could drive implements directly from the engine. The power takeoff meant the Farmall could operate grain binders, corn pickers, and other driven implements, making it a genuinely multi-purpose machine rather than a specialized cultivator only. International Harvester introduced the Farmall Regular to the market in 1924 through a limited regional rollout, initially in the cotton-growing regions of the South, where row crop cultivation needs were most acute. The initial reception from farmers was cautious. A tractor that looked different from every other tractor on the market, with its narrow front end and high-arched frame, took time to build trust. Farm Implement News, the trade journal of record for the period, archived at the University of Wisconsin, documented that dealer demonstrations in 1924 and 1925 were critical to building farmer confidence. Seeing the machine navigate rows without damaging the crop was more persuasive than any advertisement. Production numbers tell the story of what happened next. In 1924, International Harvester produced 827 Farmall Regulars. By 1926, that number had risen to over 4,400. By 1930, annual production had exceeded 42,000 units. That growth rate, from 827 units in the first year to 42,000 6 years later, is documented in International Harvester's own production records and confirmed in Robert Williams' 1987 scholarly history of the American farm tractor. The growth was demand-driven. Farmers who saw the Farmall work in their neighbors' fields placed orders. Dealers reported waiting lists by 1927. Now let's look at what this machine actually replaced, because the horse-to-tractor transition of the 1920s and 1930s is one of the most thoroughly documented technological shifts in American agricultural history, and the Farmall was at its center. In 1910, the USDA Census of Agriculture recorded approximately 24.2 million horses and mules on American farms. These animals provided virtually all of the power used for tillage, cultivation, and transport on American farms. Each working horse required roughly 3 to 5 acres of cropland to produce its feed: oats, hay, corn. On a 100-acre farm, running a team of 6 horses, as many as 30 acres might be devoted entirely to feeding the animals doing the work. A tractor, by contrast, consumed fuel, not cropland. The transition from horsepower to engine power effectively added millions of productive acres back to American agriculture. USDA Bureau of Agricultural Economics data from 1940 estimated that the shift from horsepower to tractor power had effectively released between 70 and 80 million acres of former feed cropland to other agricultural uses across the United States. 70 to 80 million acres is roughly the land area of Colorado, released to food production. The magnitude of that shift is difficult to overstate. The Farmall Regular was not the only tractor participating in this transition, but it was the machine that made row crop farms part of it. Before the Farmall, row crop farmers could use tractors for plowing and hauling, but still needed horses for cultivation. The Farmall eliminated that dependency. One machine could now do everything. That completeness, a single machine for plowing, cultivating, harvesting, and belt work, is what the trade press of the era called the general-purpose tractor. The Farmall Regular was the first machine to genuinely earn that title. By 1930, every major tractor manufacturer in the United States had introduced a row crop competitor to the Farmall. John Deere introduced the two-cylinder Model GP in 1928. Alice Chalmers introduced the Model UC in 1930. Oliver introduced the row crop 70 in 1935. Every one of those machines used a narrow front end derived from the geometry International Harvester had pioneered in 1924. The tricycle front end became the industry standard for row crop tractors and remained so until the wide front end was re-engineered in the 1960s. The Farmall Regular was produced from 1924 through 1932. In 1932, International Harvester replaced it with the Farmall F20, a refined and more powerful successor that retained the same fundamental geometry. The F20, in turn, was succeeded by the Farmall H in 1939, the model that would become one of the most produced tractors in American history, with over 390,000 units built by 1953. The Farmall H's success, 390,000 units built over 14 years, is the direct legacy of the engineering decisions made in the original Farmall Regular in 1924. The geometry that worked in 1924 was refined, not replaced. The Smithsonian National Museum of American History holds a Farmall Regular in its agricultural machinery collection, one of the surviving examples of the original 1924 model, preserved for its engineering significance. That preservation reflects something the collectors and restorers in this audience already understand. The Farmall Regular was not just a useful machine. It was a machine that changed the geometric assumptions of an entire industry. Today, Farmall Regulars are among the most sought-after machines in the vintage tractor market, not because they are powerful by modern standards, but because they represent a specific moment when an engineering problem was solved for the first time. Let's now look at what the practical lessons from the Farmall Regular's development can tell us about agricultural machinery in general, because the pattern that produced the Farmall is not unique to that machine. The first lesson, the problem that was being solved, was not a power problem. It was a geometry problem. Engineers who added more horsepower to conventional tractors and tried to force them into row crops failed. The engineers who rethought the geometry succeeded. This pattern, where the solution requires rethinking the geometry rather than increasing the force, appears repeatedly in the history of agricultural equipment. John Deere's steel plow was not about making a stronger plow. It was about changing the surface geometry so that soil released rather than clogged. The self-propelled combine was not about a more powerful engine. It was about putting the operator in a different geometric relationship to the grain flow. The Farmall Regular belongs to that family of solutions, machines that worked not because they were more powerful, but because they were positioned correctly relative to the work. The second lesson, adoption takes demonstration. The Farmall Regular's production growth from 827 units in 1924 to 42,000 by 1930 was driven by farmer-to-farmer observation, not advertising campaigns. A farmer in Illinois who saw the machine navigate his neighbor's corn rows without leaving a damaged plant was more persuaded than any technical specification could make him. What the eye could verify, the hand was willing to buy. This pattern, where demonstrated field performance drives adoption faster than any specification sheet, is documented across nearly every major agricultural equipment introduction of the 20th century. The third lesson, the geometry that worked was not refined into extinction. It was refined into the next machine. The Regular's tricycle front became the F20's geometry, which became the H's geometry, which remained in production through 1953. Good engineering solutions tend to propagate, not because engineers copy blindly, but because a geometry that matches the physical requirements of a task continues to match those requirements until the task changes. The task, navigating between row crops to cultivate, did not fundamentally change between 1924 and 1960, so the geometry did not need to fundamentally change either. For anyone with a Farmall Regular in the barn, or anyone considering one, a few practical notes drawn from the historical record. The Farmall Regular used a magneto-ignition system, a self-contained electrical generator that produces the spark without a battery. Magneto timing is the most common cause of difficult starting on surviving examples, and most can be reset by a competent small engine mechanic. The cooling system used a thermosiphon design, no water pump. Coolant circulates by natural convection. Hot water rises to the radiator, cools, and sinks back. The system works reliably as long as the coolant passages are free of scale buildup. The transmission offered 4 forward speeds and 1 reverse, adequate for the cultivation and belt work the machine was designed for, but noticeably limited for transport use on modern roads. Parts availability for the Farmall Regular ranges from good to excellent depending on the component. The basic engine parts, rings, bearings, gaskets, are reproduced by multiple suppliers. The more unusual components, particularly the belly mount cultivator frames, are increasingly found only through specialist dealers and swap meets. The Farmall Regular in good running condition is a capable working machine even today, not for high acreage modern operations, but for the scale of work it was designed to do: a small farm, a large garden, a homestead with row crops and occasional belt work. That's the real story of the Farmall Regular, documented, recorded, and still relevant to anyone who works row crops, collects vintage iron, or simply wants to understand how one engineering decision in 1924 changed the geometry of American farming. It was not the most powerful tractor of its era. It was not the most technologically complex. What it was positioned correctly, and in farming, as in engineering, position is often everything. If this kind of documented equipment history is what you come here for, subscribe to The Quiet Farmer. We're building a library of these stories, verified, sourced, and told without dramatization. In the comments, tell us, did your family farm run a Farmall? And which model, or if you have one today, what condition is it in, and what do you use it for? The people watching this video are exactly the right people to ask. The lesson here isn't nostalgia, it's that some things were built to last for a reason, and understanding the reason is what The Quiet Farmer is for.